I still remember the exact moment my car pulled into the driveway, the way my foot eased off the brake as my eyes tried to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, my brain refused to register it. The front of my house looked wrong, like a photograph that had been altered badly. Then the words came into focus. Thick, uneven letters sprayed across the siding, the garage door, even the white fence I had painted myself the previous summer. The red and black paint bled down the walls in angry streaks, dripping like something wounded. My quiet little home in Portland, the place I had worked so hard to afford, was covered in hate. I stepped out of the car slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Each step toward the house felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's nightmare. The messages weren't random. They weren't meaningless graffiti. They were personal. Accusations, insults, words that knew exactly where to hit. Whoever had done this didn't just want to damage my property. They wanted to humiliate me, to mark me, to make sure I felt small standing in my own yard. Neighbors' curtains twitched as I stood there frozen, keys still in my hand. I could feel their eyes on me, curiosity mixed with discomfort. This was a quiet street. People waved when they walked their dogs. Kids rode bikes up and down the block. Nothing like this ever happened here. And now my house was screaming a story I hadn't chosen to tell. I walked closer, my fingers hovering inches from the paint, as if touching it might confirm it was real. The smell of fresh spray paint burned my nose. This hadn't happened days ago. This was recent. Someone had stood right here, in the open, long enough to cover nearly every visible surface. They weren't afraid of being seen. That realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. Anger came next, hot and sharp, cutting through the shock. I felt exposed, violated, stripped of the safety I associated with my front door. This house was supposed to be my refuge, the place where I could shut out the noise of the world. Instead, it had been turned into a public accusation. I thought about the hours I worked, the sacrifices I made, the careful budgeting, and lonely nights that led me here. All of it felt mocked by those dripping letters. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me back into the moment. I pulled it out without thinking and started recording. Not because I had a plan, but because something in me knew this needed to be captured. My hands shook as I panned the camera across the walls, the fence, the driveway. I heard my own breathing in the video, uneven and sharp. I didn't narrate. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke loudly enough on its own. Standing there, filming the destruction, a heavier realization settled in. This wasn't random cruelty. This was familiar. The tone, the wording, the bitterness behind it, it all felt uncomfortably close to home. My chest tightened as memories surfaced. Moments I had brushed off for years. Small comments, backhanded jokes, silences filled with resentment. The house wasn't just vandalized. A boundary had been crossed in a way that could never be undone. As the sun dipped lower and the streetlights flickered on, I ended the recording and lowered my phone. My home looked smaller somehow, surrounded by darkness and judgment. But beneath the shock and the anger, something else was growing. Resolve. Whoever did this wanted me to feel powerless. Standing there in front of my ruined house, I realized I was done protecting other people's comfort at the expense of my own. The night I came home to a house covered in hate was the night everything I had been silent about finally demanded to be seen. Looking back, the signs were always there, scattered through years of small moments I taught myself to ignore. My younger sister's jealousy never announced itself loudly at first. It lived in side glances, in jokes that landed a little too sharply, in the way her smile tightened whenever someone complimented me. Growing up, we were close in age, but worlds apart in how we were treated. I learned early how to be independent, how to make myself small enough not to provoke conflict. She learned that attention could be demanded, that mistakes could be softened, that someone else would always step in to clean up the mess. As we got older, the imbalance only grew. Every achievement of mine seemed to irritate her in ways she never admitted out loud. When I finished school, she joked that I was lucky. When I got my first steady job, she said I had good timing. When I bought my house, the congratulations felt forced, followed quickly by comments about how unfair the market was, how some people always seemed to land on their feet. Nothing was ever directly hostile, but nothing was ever genuinely supportive either. It was jealousy wrapped in denial, polished enough to pass as sibling rivalry. Family gatherings became exercises in tension. I could feel her watching me from across the room, measuring herself against me in silence. If I talked about work, she changed the subject. If relatives praised my independence, she found a way to remind everyone of her struggles, her bad luck, her need for understanding. Our parents, well-meaning but exhausted, smoothed things over the same way they always had, by excusing her behavior and asking me to be patient. I was told to be the bigger person. So often, it started to feel like my assigned role in the family. Over time, that quiet resentment fermented. She never asked me for help directly, but she made sure I knew she felt wronged by my stability. If something went wrong in her life, it somehow traced back to me having something she didn't: a better job, a safer home, a sense of direction. I became a symbol of everything she believed was denied to her, whether I had anything to do with it or not. The more I tried to stay neutral, the more invisible the line between us became, until it finally snapped. The vandalism didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of swallowed anger and unspoken competition. In her mind, I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was an enemy who represented every disappointment she refused to take responsibility for. The hateful words sprayed across my house echoed sentiments I had heard in quieter forms for years, muttered under her breath or hidden behind sarcasm. Seeing them blown up and written in paint made it impossible to deny what I had avoided for so long. What hurt the most wasn't just the damage to my home, but the clarity it brought. There was no misunderstanding left to cling to, no way to frame her behavior as stress or bad timing. The jealousy I had spent years minimizing had finally shown its true face. It wasn't insecurity anymore. It was entitlement. It was the belief that my success was a personal insult to her existence. As the reality settled in, so did a painful understanding of my own role in letting it reach this point. By staying quiet, by accepting imbalance as normal, I had helped create a space where resentment could grow unchecked. The explosion wasn't sudden, it was overdue. Years of silent jealousy didn't just explode in a single night. They built pressure slowly, patiently, until destruction felt justified to the person carrying it. That realization changed how I saw my family forever. The rivalry was never harmless, and the tension was never imaginary. It had simply been ignored long enough to rot. What stood in front of me now wasn't just a damaged house, but the undeniable proof of a fracture that had been forming since childhood, waiting for the moment it could no longer stay hidden. After the initial shock wore off and the anger settled into something heavier, I stood in my driveway with my phone still in my hand, staring at the screen as if it might tell me what to do next. For most of my life, staying quiet had been my instinct. Silence kept the peace. Silence avoided confrontation. Silence made family gatherings bearable. But standing there in front of my vandalized home, I knew that silence had also protected the wrong people for far too long. I thought about how easily this could be brushed aside if I let it. A quick cleanup, a few vague explanations to neighbors, an unspoken agreement within the family to handle it privately. That was the pattern I knew well. Problems were buried, not solved. Harm was minimized, not acknowledged. And I was always expected to absorb the discomfort so everyone else could feel normal again. The idea of doing that now made my stomach turn. Lifting my phone again, I started recording with intention this time. I walked slowly around the house, documenting every wall, every word, every streak of paint. I made sure the time and date were visible. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't add music or commentary. I simply let the camera witness what had been done. It felt strange to turn something so personal into a digital record, but it also felt grounding. This wasn't about revenge in that moment. It was about refusing to let the truth disappear. As I recorded, a sense of clarity settled over me. I realized how many times I had been told not to make things public, not to embarrass the family, not to air dirty laundry. Those warnings had always come at my expense. The damage was already public. My house sat on a visible street, marked for anyone to see. Pretending otherwise would only deepen the injustice. For the first time, I understood that protecting my own reality mattered more than protecting an image that had never protected me. When I posted the video on Facebook, my finger hovered over the screen longer than I expected. Once it was out there, I couldn't control the response. People would ask questions. Opinions would form. lines would be drawn. But there was also relief in that loss of control. I was tired of managing everyone else's comfort. With one tap, I shared the video and set the phone down, my heart racing, as if I had just crossed an invisible line. The response was immediate. Notifications began stacking up faster than I could read them. Messages from friends, coworkers, neighbors, even people I hadn't spoken to in years flooded in. Shock, support, anger on my behalf. Some offered help cleaning up. Others urged me to call the police. A few asked gently if I was safe. Each message felt like a small hand reaching out, steadying me in a moment when I had felt completely alone. What struck me most was how many people said the same thing in different words. I did the right thing by not staying quiet. That validation was something I didn't realize I had been starving for. For so long, I had questioned my own reactions, wondering if I was overreacting, if my feelings were too much. Seeing others respond with clarity and concern helped untangle years of self-doubt. Posting that video wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about reclaiming my voice. It was about creating a record that couldn't be rewritten or softened later. In choosing to document and share, I drew a line that had never existed before. I showed, both to others and to myself, that my boundaries were real and worth defending. By the end of the night, as I scrolled through the comments and messages, the fear I had felt earlier began to shift. In its place was something steadier, something stronger. I understood then that turning on my camera wasn't an impulsive act. It was a breaking point, a refusal to disappear quietly, a decision to let the truth stand exactly as it was, unfiltered and undeniable. I woke up the next morning to a phone that felt heavier than it ever had before. Overnight, the video had spread far beyond my own circle. What I had shared in a moment of resolve was now being watched, discussed, and reshared by people I had never met. Friends tagged friends. Neighbors commented publicly. Strangers reacted with outrage, sympathy, and questions. The internet had done what my family never had. It looked directly at the situation and refused to look away. As the comments multiplied, a clear pattern emerged. People weren't confused about what they were seeing. They recognized the behavior for what it was: targeted, personal, and deliberate. Many pointed out details I hadn't even noticed in my shock: the specific phrases used, the placement of the messages, the confidence it took to stand there long enough to do that much damage. The clarity of outside perspectives stripped away any remaining doubt I might have had. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attack. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative solidified without my intervention. I didn't name anyone. I didn't accuse anyone publicly. I simply showed the truth. And yet, people connected the dots in ways my family had always avoided. They spoke openly about boundaries, accountability, and consequences. Words that had been treated like threats in my family became statements of common sense online. Reading them felt like stepping into a world where reality wasn't negotiable. Messages arrived from people who had watched similar patterns play out in their own lives. Sisters, brothers, parents, entire families unraveling under the weight of favoritism and denial. They shared their stories with me in private messages, confiding pain that mirrored my own. It was overwhelming, but it was also grounding. I wasn't alone. What I had endured wasn't unique or exaggerated. It was part of a cycle that many people recognized instantly once it was visible. Meanwhile, the silence from my family grew louder by the hour. No one reached out to ask if I was okay. No one acknowledged the damage or the fear. Instead, I received indirect messages through mutual acquaintances suggesting I should take the video down, that things were getting out of hand. The contrast was sharp. The internet demanded accountability, while my family demanded discretion. For the first time, I saw clearly which side was asking me to disappear. As the post continued to circulate, consequences began forming on their own. Neighbors mentioned police reports. Coworkers asked if I needed time off. Someone I didn't know offered to help cover cleanup costs. These weren't just comments, they were actions. The support wasn't passive. It was practical, rooted in the shared belief that what happened mattered and deserved response. That collective recognition carried more weight than any private apology ever could have. The internet can be cruel, but in this moment, it was precise. It cut through denial with blunt honesty. It reflected back a version of the situation that wasn't softened by history or obligation. Seeing my experience validated so publicly forced a reckoning my family could no longer delay. The truth was no longer contained within whispered conversations or strained dinners. It was visible, documented, and affirmed by hundreds of voices. By the end of that day, I understood something I hadn't before. When the internet saw what my family wouldn't, it wasn't betrayal, it was balance. It was the first time the scale tipped away from silence and toward accountability. The story no longer belonged to those who benefited from minimizing it. It belonged to the facts, the evidence, and the undeniable response of people who recognized harm and refused to excuse it. The first sign that something had shifted was the sudden absence. After days of chaos, messages, and noise, my sister went completely silent. Her social media accounts stopped updating. Her phone went straight to voicemail. People who had seen her regularly began asking if anyone had heard from her. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me expected an outburst, a denial, an attempt to twist the story back into something she could survive. Instead, she vanished, and that disappearance spoke louder than any argument ever could. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like pressure. With her gone from the conversation, the family could no longer redirect blame or smooth things over. There was no one actively rewriting events, no one demanding sympathy, no emotional smokescreen to hide behind. The focus shifted, uncomfortably and inevitably, to what had actually happened. The vandalism, the evidence. The video that was still circulating, still being discussed. Her absence removed the last distraction. Family members who had avoided the topic now had nothing else to talk around. Questions that had been postponed were suddenly unavoidable. People wanted explanations that no one was prepared to give. Why had things been allowed to reach this point? Why had resentment been ignored for so long? Why was accountability always delayed until it became impossible to deny? Without her presence to dominate the emotional space, those questions landed where they always should have. I noticed the change in tone first. Conversations became quieter, more careful. Defensiveness gave way to discomfort. Excuses sounded hollow when spoken aloud without her there to reinforce them. For years, her behavior had been explained away as stress, sensitivity, bad luck. Now those explanations felt thin against the reality of spray-painted walls and documented proof. The disappearance forced people to sit with the truth instead of managing her reactions. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt. I hadn't wanted her to run. I hadn't wanted things to end this way. But I couldn't ignore what her absence revealed. When she was no longer present to command attention, the damage she had caused became clearer, not smaller. Her disappearance didn't erase what she'd done. It outlined it. The void she left behind traced the shape of accountability everyone had been avoiding. In that space, something shifted inside me too. I stopped waiting for explanations that would never come. I stopped imagining conversations where she suddenly understood or took responsibility. The silence answered questions I had carried for years. It confirmed what I had been reluctant to accept, that some people would rather disappear than face the consequences of their actions. That truth was painful, but it was also grounding. As days passed, the focus moved away from her and toward repair. Practical steps replaced emotional chaos. Reports were finalized. Cleanup began. Support continued, steady and real. Life didn't return to normal, but it moved forward. And in that movement, the power dynamic changed. Her absence meant she no longer controlled the narrative. The truth stood on its own, no longer competing with denial or deflection. The disappearance forced an ending that conversation never could. It closed the door on excuses and opened one to clarity. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final speech, just a quiet reckoning that settled over everything like dust after a storm. What remained was reality, stripped of noise and obligation. In the end, her vanishing didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the line I had drawn mattered, that the truth didn't need permission to exist, and that sometimes healing begins not with reconciliation, but with the undeniable clarity that comes when someone chooses to walk away rather than face what they've done.